Whilst everyone in the new year is focused on 226, what will happen in the May elections, will Starmer still be Prime Minister, and probably more pertinently, will Rachel Reeves still be Chancellor, will politics have taken a lurch to the left, will Farage have peaked? These are all questions for this year. And there are also immediate global questions for this year. Will truce break out between Ukraine and Russia and some kind of peace? Will China invade Taiwan? And will the US precipitate the end of the Venezuelan regime? Oh, and by the way, will the Iranian Revolution fall to this round of protests? So it's right to have a look through the next 12 months and think, well, what's going to happen? How different could the world be? But while we're focused on the short term, a more important question for the future of the economy, for the future of our infrastructures, for the future of our standard of living, is to focus a bit further down the line at 2030. It's only 4 or 5 years away, and in the structure of building a new railway line, sewage works, transmission cables, and more mobile and cyber infrastructure, in that kind of timescale, 4 or 5 years is just a blink. In the British system, it probably takes you that long to get through the planning processes. So let's just look forward to 2030 and imagine the world then, and then work back to what that means for decisions that people are making today. Well, by 2030, there will have been at least one general election, and there's a good chance there might have been 2, because in the current political setting, with 5 parties at over 10% of the vote, it looks like the next general election, when it comes, might be next year, is going to be a crowded one. Add in the Scottish nationalists and the Welsh nationalists too, and we're playing a multi-party European-style political system. So if that's what happens, then a hung parliament's extremely likely at the next election, and that means that instability will probably follow. And we know from previous instability moments in British politics that usually another election follows pretty quickly. I'm thinking particularly of the mid-1970s, but there are other examples with Boris Johnson, etc., which come to mind. So we could have had 2 general elections by then. The Ukraine and the Taiwanese position will probably have been clarified in 4 or 5 years' time. At some stage, the current round of fightings in Ukraine will come to what in historic terms is probably best described as a temporary truce. This has been going on essentially since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and who's to say there's any permanent peace to be settled. But at least there might not be any live exchange of fire. On the Taiwan side, it's unlikely that the current Chinese leader is going to allow this to run on for another 4 years, not least because taking back Taiwan is what he sees as his major legacy, and he's getting older. And by 2030, his future will be very much one for the history books rather than more stuff he's going to do. So Taiwan will probably have been taken back by the Chinese by 2030. That will lead to a world which is already in shape: fortress China, fortress Russia, and increasingly fortress America, by which I include not just the United States, but the relationship between the United States and Canada in the north, and Latin America and Mexico to the south. The world will continue, probably, to move into its blocs, and although trade remains key to the way in which this world works, the reality is that Chinese drive for self-sufficiency and security in all its core commodities, food, etc., is likely to be writ large across the world even further. And at that stage, we'll also have a much more substantive India, Indonesia, and indeed those Latin American economies by then. By 2032, I doubt much progress will have been made on climate change, so it's going to be worse. What? Another 8 parts per million added to the 425 or 426 we already have, well past 1.5 degrees, and no credible global structure to deal with those problems. The AI and quantum revolution will be seen for what it will by then be, either a transformation, as much of the hype points to, or another incremental addition to the way in which technologies work. And we'll know a little bit more about the impacts on unemployment. So that'll be part of the frame. The big one, and these are the ones that people tend to leave out between now and 2030, is that there's very likely to have been a major global financial correction. If you look back in history, in each of the big corrections, there has been before it euphoria, there have been bubbles, and very few people think of what happens afterwards when the bubbles inevitably burst. The idea that the markets could carry on, as they have done for the last few years, reaching ever higher levels, that one US company can be valued at more already than 2 of the major European economies. This kind of stuff is the stuff of herd behavior, crowd psychology, and it has to come to an end. The question is whether it peters out between now and 2030 or whether there's a crunch. My hunch is on a big crunch. And in 2030, it'll be very much like it was in, say, 2010, in the aftermath of the carnage that follows almost every major financial correction. Who knows where it'll go this time? It's not likely to be subprime. Private equity stands out as extremely vulnerable. And continuation funds, these sorts of games are what happens at peak as people try to cash out their position. And the equity story is very hard to sustain at its current levels. Most likely, the big problem is the bond markets. That's the private equity side and the reliance on debt financing for the equity valuations. And it's likely also to bring in the completely unsustainable government debt position. US, most of Europe, certainly China, are all extremely badly exposed to a correction. Now, that I don't think is hard to predict over a period that long. What is hard to predict is what governments will then do. That's what shapes what 2030 will actually look like. Will they resort to pushing interest rates to the floor and more QE? Well, that depends on whether markets stomach that kind of action, whether they get terribly excited by that kind of behaviour and markets bounce back, or whether this time around there just isn't the scope to do it. My hunch is that governments will try to do what Gordon Brown did in this country, which is save the world. You can imagine our current Chancellor echoing her predecessor's claim to save the world. It's in a mix with the way in which British politics goes, but that depends, of course, whether the current Chancellor is there. But even with the reaching for all the financial and monetary levers, my guess is that this time it's likely to lead to even more debasement of the currencies, and that means that in 2030 we will be in the throes of, or in the aftermath of, a big burst of inflation. Essentially, that's how the debt gets written off, but a big inflationary burst is one which is going to wreak havoc on political systems and on the tolerance of the political framework to absorb what might follow. Normally what happens in a big bust is it's more state, more state, more state, and the private sector gets squeezed, twice, once for the damage that the market corrections do, and once by the state setting into the framework. Of course, there's a perfectly plausible alternative to this, and I'll come to that in a moment, but that's one possibility. So if I look out to 2030, I look at the political landscape in the UK, and it's almost anyone's bet as what might emerge. My guess is that at the next election, the Conservative Party will probably be the largest party. I think Pete Farage is probably correct. I think the Conservatives are slowly clawing back their position, and I think Labour is hopelessly divided on the left. But I may be very wrong about that. It's a very open field, and all sorts of potential outcomes come to the fore, although a left Green Party Labour coalition agreement to put together a government would fall foul of the bond markets very quickly. But there's all that stuff out there to happen in the short term, but of all these things, I think it's the market correction, which is the big one, short of actual military engagement between major players as opposed to proxy wars, etc., that we've got used to. So if it's likely that the levers will be reached for which trigger lots and lots of currency debasement and probably lots of inflation, what are the models within which the kinds of investments that people are already trying to carry forward will actually be set after 2030? Well, there's really three possibilities out there, maybe many more. One is the most likely, which is more of the same muddling through. British politics, much of European politics, has muddled its way through since the dot-com boom and the crash of 2000, 1999, 2000. It's muddled its way through the financial crash of 2007, 2008. It's muddled its way through growing public expenditure, and it's muddled its way through COVID, and it's now muddling its way through the public expenditure pressures across the pitch, and particularly demand for more defence spending. That's one possibility. Another is that 50 years after the previous serious change of direction in 1979, we have another, in inverted commas, Thatcher moment. Now, it's not going to be the policies that Thatcher proposed in their precise formats, but every 50 years or so is a reasonable time horizon over which people stand back and say, we just can't go on like this. We can't go on living beyond our means. We can't go on living beyond our environmental means too. We cannot push taxation any further. Public expenditure just grows and grows. There has to be a fundamental reset. And for Western economies, particularly in Europe, UK, that means a reset of social security and public expenditure. The third option, and they're not really separable, there's a lot of overlap, is what you might call Fortress Britain. This is the Miliband homegrown world. We're going to have homegrown energy. We're going to have homegrown food. We're going to echo and ape what the Chinese are doing and extend to what the Americans are doing, surrounded by tariff supports, etc. Now, that may work for China. That may work for the United States, particularly with Latin America as backdoor. It's hard to see how this results in saving the British economy and indeed homegrown Britain in a fortress model 2030 beyond looks more like East Germany used to look than it looks like a vibrant, growing economy, outward looking and open to trade and so on. And it's a nasty politics that goes with a fortress approach of the left and the right, and it's a much more state-directed world in which profits made by sucking up to whatever politician and government happens to be in office. So there's some thoughts about 2030 and the world forward. Is it a good world or a bad world? Well, silly question. But if you look at the ticking away of the technology underneath and you look at the options that are out there in front of us, there's no reason why this can't be a prosperous and indeed green world into the future. But I think the conclusion I draw is that 2030 can't be that sunny upland in the current model, and that something will have to give. And my guess is that something gives before 2030, and my guess is financial markets are the place to look for the catalyst of changes which are probably necessary from any political perspective. But let's see. Thank you.